Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and welcome to this exciting webinar, Calling in the Call-Out Culture with Loretta Ross. It's my great pleasure to introduce Loretta, professor who teaches in the program in the study for women and gender at Smith. Loretta is a Black feminist. She has fought for human rights for 5 decades, founding the National Center for Human Rights Education in Atlanta, serving as national coordinator of the sister song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, and co-creating the theory of reproductive justice. Loretta, as I'm sure you all know, has received innumerable awards for her work, including a 2022 MacArthur Genius Grant for shaping a visionary paradigm linking social justice, human rights, and reproductive justice. Her TED Talk on calling in the call-out culture, the topic of today's webinar, has had, wait for it, more than 2 million views. Loretta has shown over and over again her ability to identify what's going on, to cut through the noise and just tell it like it is. She's an insightful and important voice for justice. And we are so fortunate that she has joined us at Smith as a tenured professor, and to be able to give you this opportunity today to hear directly from her about her pioneering work. On a personal note, I want to say to you, Loretta, I appreciate you as a sister scholar and friend. And to the rest of you, her voice consistently broadens our perspectives and draws our attention to topics we often find easier to overlook. As I have been inspired and enriched by her teachings, I am confident that today's session will provide you too with a similar opportunity to grow and embrace new behavior. So with that, I want to say to you, my sister friend, my sister scholar, welcome, Loretta.
Well, thank you, Denise, for such a wonderful welcome. I am so proud to be at Smith. I don't know how to stop my shivering because I wake up every day saying, is this my life kind of thing? I have to honestly confess, though, I went to Agnes Scott College, your sister college in the South. So I'm a Scotty, I'm not a Smithy, but obviously going to another premier women's college well prepared me for coming to Smith. Now, I should just say that this whole calling in project was birthed at Smith in 2016, long before I became a faculty member. I was doing a writing fellowship through the 5 College Women's Studies Center. So I was housed over at Mount Holyoke. And one of the things I noticed when we were organizing a project with Gloria Steinem, Gloria's a good friend, in the women's movement. I didn't meet her when I came to Smith. We go way, way back. Anyway, we were organizing a project with Gloria, and I happened to notice how mean people were being to each other on social media. And the only reason I was on social media is because my grandson pretended he couldn't answer a phone call from grandma. He said, "Oh, grandma, get on Facebook." And that's the way you reach me. Then I got on Facebook and he migrated off to TikTok or whatever it is. So I wasn't following him around the internet, so I stayed on Facebook. And then I noticed how mean people were to each other. So when I was organizing with Gloria, I asked one of those young people we were working with, is this the way people are? Because I believe that they're saying things online that they wouldn't dare say to someone's face. And she said, "Oh, you mean the call out culture?" I said, "Is that what y'all call it?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, what are y'all doing about it?" She shrugged, like there was nothing that could be done. Well, that answer didn't rest well with me because by then I'd done 45 years of work in the women's movement, basically. I was the director of the first rape crisis center in this country. That's how I got into doing women's rights work. I was sterilized when I was 23, so that led me into reproductive rights work. And one of the things I had always done as part of my activism is find a way to have the difficult conversations with the most unlikely people, like teaching Black feminist theory to Black men incarcerated for rape. I did that in the 1990s. I deprogrammed people who'd been in the Klan and the neo-Nazi movement. These are not people I'd want to bring home for dinner, but I found a way to talk to them. And of course, as a Black woman in the feminist movement, I considered everybody my problematic ally. So I talked to them. And so I felt that young people didn't have the skill set that we developed organically to have difficult conversations with people. And it's not their fault. I think it's driven by social media. I really do think it's the times that we live in that provide the anonymity that seeks that approval of likes and things like that that we didn't have to deal with. And Lord knows all of us are lucky enough that nobody had a cell phone when we were at our most stupid teenage years. As I was talking to this young person, I decided, first of all, I wasn't going to speak up because it's a young person's world in terms of social media and stuff. I don't even know what I'm doing. My VCR is still blinking from the 1980s. But then it kept accelerating, and the acceleration became so damaging that it was hurting those of us who are trying to do human rights work because we're kind of used to people that we fight talking bad about us, not the people that we have to work with talking bad about us. And we don't have any skills for that. And so in 2016, I had a student symposium at Smith, and Kathy McCartney gave me the money to put it on. And about 100 students showed up and told us about how damaging the call out culture was to them. Carrie Baker helped me organize it, who's also in Women in Gender Studies with me. And they said that they were censoring themselves. They were afraid to say what truthfully was in their minds, that they were just basically wearing masks because they didn't feel they could be their authentic selves without fear of repercussions. And so that encouraged me to start writing a book on calling in the calling out culture in 2016. Unfortunately, also in 2016, my only child, my son Howard, died of a heart attack. And so, as you can imagine, that grief made me shelf it for 3 years while I recovered from, you know, the, the reality that your children are not supposed to die before you, kind of thing. But he left me a great grandson, so at least I'm not reproductively terminated. But, it took me a while to pick it up again. And so in 2019, I picked it up again. Uh, then the pandemic happened. And so finally, I'm in the final throes of editing the book, and Simon and Schuster gave me a nice contract. And hopefully they'll release it in January of 2025. So that's where we are with the book. But because of the pandemic, I took what I was teaching at Smith online because I thought that, I couldn't just sit around home and wait for classes to resume and all of that. So I was teaching my Smith classes online, and I started calling in classes online. And my next class starts August 1. Uh, I call myself the Walmart of consciousness raising because registration for the class is $5. $5 online classes. Try to beat that bargain. And the whole set is 4 classes, so the whole set is only $20 and stuff. And you can register at my website, lorettajross.com. Because in this brief presentation, I won't have a chance to go over a lot of technique with y'all. You got to get that in the class. Here, I'm going to talk about the need and the theory. But the classes are available to anybody. Like I said, $5. So let's talk about the call out culture. One of the things that's most important to do when you're talking about calling in with young people is to talk about the importance of maintaining hope, because they are so convinced that doing work for human rights is pointless if they don't see the results on the timeline that they want. They want, the revolution to be tomorrow. They want the change that they're demanding to happen instantly. They do it over and over and over again. And so I talk about hope and how important it is not to ignore what has happened in the past or is happening now, but understanding that it's because those things are happening, which is why we do the work. And we never really know the consequences of what we do, but we know we need to do them. Foucault talks about people know what they do without knowing the impact of what they do, which is all right with me because I'm not in charge of the universal timeline. But we need to help them understand uncertainty, help them understand that our work is experimental, because it's harder to change hearts and minds than it is to probably levitate somebody with my brain. And so we can teach them how the work against oppression takes a lifetime, but you can and will see results in your lifetime. Like when the first Rape Crisis Center was founded in 1972, we could not have predicted the popularity and visibility of the Me Too movement now. But we did the right thing back then so that the Me Too movement could emerge now. I truly believe that how we do the work is as important as the work that we do towards human rights. And so I very famously say that calling in will affect the human rights movement in the 21st century the same way nonviolence affected the civil rights movement in the 20th. It's a testament of our values. It's an example of the world we want to build and the people we want to be in that world. I keep talking about human rights, and I'm not going to give you a human rights education now, but I do in my classes. But what I want people to do is see themselves as part of an interconnected, intersectional human rights movement that has a women's rights wing, that has a civil rights wing, that has a disability rights wing, and a movement against transphobia and homophobia wing, and economic justice and indigenous rights and environmental justice, and on and on. My point is, I don't have enough room to put all the arrows that are necessary. But if we see ourselves as part of a unified human rights movement, then we do our work in such a way so that we don't fight for women's rights in a racist way, but we don't fight for trans rights in a misogynist way, or civil rights in a xenophobic way, because we can't fight for human rights while violating someone else's human rights, because that's a contradiction. And so my political goal is to have everyone see themselves as part of the same movement with different things that they focus on, but to not do that work in such a way that it creates contradictions within your own same movement. So here goes theory. When I noticed the calling out culture, I started thinking about it. And I decided to come up with a simple, accessible way to explain it and what we should do about it. And I call it the 5 C's continuum. I should also add that this has been transcribed into a handbook for students by Toby Davis in the Office of Equity and Inclusion. So they've got something they can walk away with, refer to, a cheat sheet, so to speak, for the Smith students. Now, we're all familiar with calling out. That's publicly shaming people for something that you think they've done wrong, but you think they need to be held accountable. Uh, the thing that's working the most in that sentence is publicly doing it. Because if you wanted to simply offer someone a correction, you could have easily talked to them privately. So the fact that you're doing it publicly means that it's being staged, that you want other people to notice that you are calling someone else out. And people often self-justify that, saying, well, I'm just trying to hold them accountable. Well, no, you're trying to be seen holding someone accountable, because accountability can be achieved in many other ways than the one you're choosing. The ultimate call out is canceling somebody. When you think that someone has done something so wrong that you want to get them really good, you don't just want them to be publicly shamed, but you want them to get fired. You want them to lose their reputation, or at least lose their platform. And of course, that most closely replicates the prison industrial complex, because that means that you want to punish them, exile them, silence them, and disappear them, because that's what society wants to do with criminals. So that begs the question of whether or not we as a human rights movement can use the tactics of the state when we don't have the money, the power, and the influence of the state. And moreover, it's not even working that well for the state, for the government, because there's this thing called recidivism, where punishing, silencing, and exiling people ain't necessarily reducing the crime rate. So we need to question, why are we trying to cancel people in the first place instead of seeking another way? Calling in is not the opposite of calling out. It is also an accountability process. So with calling out, canceling, and calling in, you want to hold people accountable. But the method that you use with calling in is based on love and respect, not anger, blaming, and shaming. Calling in is your modeling how you'd like people to treat each other by modeling how you're going to treat someone else. And I'm going to talk more about that. There's an intermediate step between calling out and calling in that's called calling on. And the reason Sonia Renee Taylor created the concept of calling on, because she pointed out to me, there's sometimes you don't want to call people in or out, because both of those steps require you to make an emotional investment of time and energy into someone else's growth. And what happens if you just want to tell them to talk to the hand, that you don't care if they get it, but you're indicating that they should do better. So you're calling on people to do better. This is a very frequently required tactic, because many times people don't realize that their inner behavior or their inner good opinions of themselves don't match their outer behaviors. For example, I play competitive pinochle with my geriatric crowd. And I have a girlfriend who's 75 years old in this crowd, who every time somebody says something, she's got to fight with them. She's got to argue with them. She's got to contradict them as a way of getting attention for herself. But what she does not realize is that that's why she's getting shunned. I was the first person to invite her to a pinochle game in 6 months, because most people don't have the patience to put up with someone that demanding, that emotionally needy, and who keeps interrupting, won't let anybody else have a word. And so when she came to my house last Friday, I interrupted her when she had interrupted for like the fifth time, and just simply asked her, how well is arguing with everybody working for you? Is that how you want to show up? And she immediately got offended and said, I guess I can't say anything. I said, no, but you need to really question whether what you have to say contributes to the conversation or stops the conversation. And I don't think any of my friends who've known her for the same 30 years I've known her had ever said that to her. And then later I checked in with her to see if she was okay. She was still angry, but I was able to show her that I cared enough to have that conversation with her, rather than continuing to let her be shunned without anybody being brave enough to call her attention to a habit that she could change. So that's an example of calling on. I don't think we spend enough time or choose frequently enough The fifth strategy, which is disengagement, calling it off. We have no obligation to participate in unproductive conversations with people who are not operating in good faith. If they're choosing to lie, if they're choosing to cherry pick their facts or descend into personal ad hominem attacks simply because they're losing the argument based on substance, we need to learn to call it off and really ask ourselves why we are so convinced that we have the magical power to change somebody else with a few words, because we don't. So the next slide is more visually representing what I just said. When you publicly demand somebody to change their behaviors, that's what you call calling out people. When you want to cancel them, that means you're punishing them with job loss or something else. When you want to call in people, that means when you want to have difficult dialogues, but you want to respect their human rights and differences. Calling on means you want people to do better, but you're not going to invest in their growth. And calling it off means disengagement. Calling in as a strategy builds very important things we need. Empathy, it helps us set emotional boundaries. It helps us grow our emotional intelligence by becoming more self-aware of the impact we not only have on others, but ourselves. Because this friend I was talking about probably was in a lot of pain when she kept getting shunned and not invited to our weekly pinochle parties. She knew they were going on, but she also knew she was not getting an invitation. And I think this pain she was feeling of being left out is one of the drivers of her constantly interrupting. And so we need to learn that kind of self awareness and have compassion for people whose pain gets revealed in their behaviors. And it helps us to develop resilience and forgiveness.
Would you say that within the 5 C's, the three in the middle are the intermediate steps between calling out and cancellation?
No, because I actually do think that there's other C's that will be added as people further develop my theory. Like I did on my online class last week, a woman said, "What about calling up?" I said, "Oh, that's interesting. I had not thought about calling up. What do you mean by calling up?" And she was talking about recruiting other people to join. I was like, "Oh, okay, that's enough." So I really think that this is a beginning. So I wouldn't sandwich the three and book in those other two. It's a continuum. So I think as we keep exploring the infinite possibilities that this transformation can give us, that we shouldn't limit ourselves to seeing it as a fixed structure. Don't be surprised at the resistance by the progressives because they're doing what they think is the right thing, but they're doing it the wrong way. And what they're doing is replicating what they think a human rights activist does, which is call out governments and corporations and individuals and draw a line in the sand and don't move because you would be compromising your morals if you did. But you can use that as a teachable moment and educate them about the human rights movement because calling out is our tactic of last resort. It's not our tactic of first resort. When you're in the human rights movement, you try to talk to people first. You try to find the right messenger that they trust, that they will listen to. You write letters. You try to get, you do a whole lot of other things before you get to the public shaming and blaming campaign. But since no one's giving them the lessons in human rights activism that can help them contextualize the call out, they just go to the call out and think that's all they need to do. And so it can be a teachable moment about how you do social justice activism without furthering the harm that you call yourself trying to eliminate. The Centers for Disease Control just issued a report not so long ago where they said that 64% of the adult American population has experienced what they call an ACE, an adverse childhood experience, which includes violence, neglect, and abuse. 64%, that's 2/3 of the American public has been through some stuff. And so part of the calling in practices that I'm trying to create and teach us is we should stop being surprised when this trauma shows up. Because statistically, it's going to show up. All right? So let's anticipate it. Let's create calling in cultures in our classroom ahead of need, our workplaces ahead of need. So it doesn't just stop everything and shock everybody and re-traumatize everybody. Since we know this is what we're dealing with, let's plan for it. We're supposed to be the smart people. We let the other world deal with, fake news and whatever thing, they're tripping on. We're the ones that should be able to analyze reality, anticipate it, plan for it, and build containers in which everybody stays in and is thought about and cared for. And I do expect when my book comes out to get more criticism from the left than the right. It is habitual of the left to be trained and call out. And by the way, we do it academically. I have never, ever read a thesis or a dissertation that doesn't say, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, and they were wrong, and I'm going to show you what's right. We train people to be hypercritical. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not trying to change how people write theses and dissertations. I'm just showing the hypercritical technique doesn't turn off when it comes to dealing with friends, family, and classmates. And so I teach students about the toggle switch that they've never heard of, or at least they didn't give themselves permission to use. Do you know your radical consciousness is something that you can switch on and off? You don't actually have to be on all the time. You can go watch Barbie without a critical feminist analysis and be okay and not be ashamed of it. Because life is supposed to be about fun and joy. It's other people that make it miserable. But you don't have to impose misery on yourself because you think that's the way you're supposed to live life. And so I find the toggle switch very convenient. We all have that choice. And I often also say to young people, if you're not having fun doing human rights work, you need to question how you're doing it. My opening slide in my white supremacy class says, fighting Nazis should be fun. It's being a Nazi that sucks. And so I'm very clear to say, let's figure out how to find our joy, our peace, our happiness, doing the right thing. I think we do need to hold people accountable for the harm that they do, but we need to do it through love and respect. And at the same time, we don't need to violate our integrity while we're doing it. Because even though I'm still dealing with my lingering trauma and the jagged edges of my biography, that doesn't mean I get to impose it on everybody else. And it is true, hurt people hurt people. So I don't want to be a hurt person hurting somebody else. That just isn't how I want to present in the world. So my integrity matters. The way that I put it, and I'm quoting another author that I won't get into, is that your reputation is what other people think about you, but your integrity is what you know about yourself. And so we should spend our energy guarding our integrity, not our reputation, because to try to guard your reputation is useless anyway, because other people see you through the lens of what they've been through, not what you've been through. So they'll never see you as the way you want to be seen unless you lead with your integrity. And I cannot stress how important that is. And quite often, for the young people in my class, that's the first time they've heard that their integrity matters more than their reputation. But I do want to teach people how to deal with harm without creating more and really create this society where people are included as the rule. And even with our mistake filled lives, we should still have a seat at the table, knowing that we're joining a whole lot of other people who also make mistakes, but they see their mistakes as learning opportunities instead of opportunities for shame, either from themselves or from others. And certainly, we can't bring more people into the human rights movement if we're going to make them feel worse about themselves than before they came. I mean, that doesn't make sense. I don't run towards pain, and I don't know anybody who does. We got to make this our human rights movement feel joyful and welcoming and fun and an opportunity for us to grow. And that's why this self reflection and self correction is so important. And it's important for us not to replicate oppressive spaces and not recreate the same system that we call ourselves criticizing. And this requires learning these healing strategies for ourselves and for others. I gave a brief definition of call out. This is a more expanded definition. I think a lot of calling out, though, is driven by people feeling unheard, disrespected, or violated. They think that's the only way they can draw some attention to themselves. I also think, though, that people want to improve their opinion of themselves when they weaponize knowledge that they have. I mean, it's kind of charming when I teach these first year students about a dense concept like heteropatriarchy, and then immediately they turn around and tell their dorm mate, you don't know what patriarchy really is, kind of thing. Because people have a way of trying to put themselves up that way. And when they banish people because they're not, quote, woke enough, I tend to push back on that quite gently, but really point out to them that when you use words like that's so performative in that contemptuous way that they say, you just put up a Black Lives Matter sign, or you just put up a rainbow flag. You don't really mean it because I don't see you at the demonstration, or I don't see you doing this. I try to tell them, if you think you're in a woke competition, all you're proving is that you're not woke enough because it's not a competition. We all have our own individual learning curves. And one of my students wrote a line in one of her essays to me that I got her permission to replicate in my book. And she wrote, calling out is the assumption that you know everything that you're supposed to know, not the reality that we're all learning. I thought that was absolutely brilliant out of the mouth of an 18-year-old, because that's it. When you call people out, you're working on the assumption that they should know better. They should know this. They should know this. But quite often, it's done to disguise the fact that you don't know all you should know. And back to the question of performativity, I invite them, when they use that word in my presence, to consider that they know all that they need to know about that person in the moment when they put up that Black Lives Matter sign or that rainbow flag or whatever. The one thing you need to know is that they're not in the Klan and they're not in the anti-gay movement, because no homophobe ever put up a rainbow flag and no white supremacist ever put up a Black Lives Matter sign. So from that meager evidence, you already know they're either a proven ally, a potential ally, or a problematic one. And in those three phrases, the most important word is ally. So figuring out how to deal with your allies is your job, not theirs. If you're as woke as you like to think that you are, because they're all allies. I do find that people use call outs to boost themselves. I did write a line in my book saying that many people seek fame without being worthy of it. And quite often they do it by trying to defame something, saying someone more famous than they are, hoping to increase their standing in the community, whether it's through likes, clicks, or whatever measurements that they use. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that the way to do human rights work is to have absolutely pure political opinions, 100% alignment on all opinions. And when they don't achieve that, then they resort to what that Florida professor talked about, the shaming, the ideological bullying. But that's a false theory of social change. Because when many different people think many different thoughts and they move in the same direction, that's a movement. But when many different people think one thought and they move in the same direction, that's a cult. And we are not building the human rights cult. So stop your cult-like behaviors calling it human rights work, because that's not what that is. That's bullying people in order to get them to agree with you so you can feel better about yourself. That's all it is. Now, there is a reason that the call-out culture is being so vociferously criticized right now, mostly by the right, because the left is trying to say there's nothing wrong with it, basically. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, who came to Smith last semester, points out that the main reason the right wing is so bitterly critical of the call-out culture is because they monopolized its power. They had the ability to control all the microphones and they used them to punch down on more vulnerable people. But now anybody with a keyboard can democratize that power. They can punch back. Most of the time they use it to punch sideways with other people that they should be working with, but they can punch upwards towards the powerful people. And so, for example, my most frequent clients for my for-profit business are coming from corporate America because many people who are in those C-suites are being surprised that their worst critics aren't their competitors, but are on their own payroll. One executive told me that he got jacked up in the restroom by a fellow employee that he didn't even recognize the guy's name. But I think what's driving this is that they're having to deal with what they weren't trained to do in their MBA classes, and that is deal with a workforce that's younger, more female, queerer, more intersectional, more loyal to the concept of respect than to a paycheck. And nobody's training them to deal with that right now. HR isn't designed to deal with that right now. And so we've got to look at this calling in, calling out culture and integrate it into all of the aspects of our society. I did a presentation yesterday to CARE, the big humanitarian organization, to all of their human rights directors from all the different countries and projects. And I urged them to write a manual using my theory on how do you intersect your human resources obligations with a calling in culture. How can you best represent the organization that pays you by helping people solve predictable conflicts at work, as opposed to trying to take one side or the other and do those kinds of things? There are appropriate uses of call outs, and I do reassure the left that there is, because when we have to deal with power disparities or when people choose to make themselves inaccessible to us and they've been offered a chance to change, but they choose not to, maybe a call out is necessary to keep them from doing more harm, because you tried to talk to them privately and they waved you off. So now you got to do it publicly. Calling out also helps you locate other people who have gone through the same thing and build community with them to help prevent those future harms. And you do that by spreading information, often through a call out. It also helps us locate those sites of harm that may be invisible to us if no one brings us to our attention. I don't do a lot of DEI work because that's not my background. I do anti-white supremacy work. But I do talk to a lot of DEI people or HR even, instead of them being alarmed when, a Black at Smith hashtag starts or gay at Wellesley hashtag starts amongst the students. Why don't you reverse how you see that and see that they're providing you information that you'd have to pay a consultant $250,000 to find out otherwise? Let's not be alarmed when they're pointing out stuff that we hadn't noticed, that we were unaware of. Let's welcome that information flow, anticipate it, and plan accordingly. And generally, they do so by lifting the voices of those we have not historically prioritized listening to. And sometimes you just want to release the outrage. When you internalize anger and pain, you usually take it out on yourself, not somebody else. So there are times when calling somebody out does that release. It just shouldn't be your only way of release. And there are few times when public shaming works. Right now, we're in an era of in what I call the Trumpification of America, where shamelessness seems to be what they seek, as opposed to avoiding public embarrassment.
Augustina writes, this past academic year, I have gotten the chance to be involved in conversations surrounding social justice work on campus. I have heard of calling in, and when talking with the other students I work with, there is a rejection of the idea. My question is, what do you say to people who see calling in as just a way for people to be comfortable in their problematic views, as well as believing that calling out is necessary to make people uncomfortable in their problematic views? And lastly, how do you call people in, but also provide constructive criticism to make sure they see a problem with what they are saying?
Well, I'm going to address the last question first, if you don't mind. I find it possible to say the most hurtful things to people with the right tone of voice. I find that if I use love and respect and use that as my vehicle, I can tell people that they've got poor taste. I can tell somebody that I didn't appreciate what they said. I can disagree with people because people remember how you made them feel much more than they remember what you said, as Maya Angelou famously said. And so when I want to offer a correction or pushback or anything to anybody, I want them to feel my concern, my compassion, and my empathy, but I don't want to mitigate the truth. I'm not going to euphemize the truth. I'm just going to convey it in as loving a way as I can. I find that people who resist calling in, they haven't done the work to find out what it is anyway. They just think it's a lesson in civility. They think that it should be used to paper over harm or ignore harm rather than excavate and hold the harm doers accountable. So they don't see it as an accountability process. They assume it's just another civility lesson. So when they say that, why don't you do that? Why don't you do to them what we asked the right wing to do when we asked them to define woke? What do you think calling in is? Have you read anything about it? Could you define it for me? And why do you think making other people feel bad is what the human rights movement is supposed to be doing? Don't you care about the human rights of the people you're making feel bad, or you only care about the human rights of the people you care about? And if that's the case, how is that different from white supremacy? So we can ask questions, but tone matters the most.
Are there appropriate uses of cancellation?
Oh, absolutely. I tend to have a decision tree based on a fairly simplistic, perhaps even oversimplified formula, because I believe that we're all capable of making mistakes and we frequently do. The question is whether you never make a mistake, because nobody can achieve that. But do you handle your mistakes as an adult or a child? If you make a mistake and it's identified and you create harm for your mistake, what do? Do you deny that you did it, that you need to be held accountable, that the harm took place? Quite often, people who are acting like a child, they deny, they double down, they repeat, they keep doing the same thing. Those are the people I'm most likely to call out or seek to cancel. But when you make a mistake, if you own the fact that you made a mistake, if you recognize that harm emanated from your mistake, and if you apologize and make a plan to do better in the future, those are the people I want to invest my time in and call in. Now, like I said, that's a fairly oversimplified way of dealing with it, but we have to teach people, first of all, you can't find a world where you can only work with perfect people. You're going to find yourself immersed with, and you're one of them, of people who will make mistakes trying to do the right thing. So the problem isn't the mistake. The problem is how they handle it. I find that how we deal with people's mistakes are often a pattern that's set in our own childhood. Because when we were children and we made a mistake, if we were severely punished for making that mistake, or shamed for making that mistake, or felt that the love of our caretaker was at risk, then we think it's perfectly natural to punish, shame other people as adults, because that's the pattern that's been set in us in how to handle someone else's mistakes and our own. But when we were a child, if someone took time to show us that they loved us despite making the mistake, and showed us what we could learn from that mistake and forgave us for that mistake, then we're going to be predisposed to offer that same type of grace to someone else as an adult. So the question for us now as adults is, do we want to continue that pattern of our childhood that punished, blamed, and shamed? Because the reason that's so dangerous is not only what you do to others, but you continue to do it to yourself when you make a mistake. Or do we want to make a different choice about handling mistakes in a much more nuanced, sophisticated way that requires self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others?
It's so important. And you mentioned it earlier, like self-realization, figuring ourselves out first. And centering love and respect, even in the process of figuring out ourselves first, is something that I really resonating with me. And I think it could be useful in any kind of conversation I might have with a person, especially if I disagree with them. So thank you.
I have to figure it out, even if I love and like them and still don't want the first thing to come out of my unfiltered mouth. Is that the best way I want to present? I have wonderful parents, so don't hear me as parent bashing, but my mother was an evangelical Christian who was hypercritical. In her effort to make her 8 children become the best we could be, nothing was ever good enough for her. If I brought home 5 A's and a B, she only saw the B. That was all she could see. And so she always kept me aiming for more without appreciating what I achieved. Well, I've learned that pattern from my mother because that's what I knew. And so I have to call myself in constantly around being hypercritical of others because I don't want to present like my mother presented. That was her way of loving her children, but I swear it left a lot of scars. And so that's the engagement with self that we're constantly in, deciding how we want to present and not being betrayed by those involuntary emotions that we don't have any control over, but we do have control over our intelligence, our response to those emotions. And that's what calling in means. Calling in means calling in yourself before you call somebody else either out or in.
Is there a good body of literature on case studies of effective results of calling out, practically versus emotionally effective?
Well, since I'm writing the first book on the topic, I don't think so. But I have 200 references in my book of adjacent literature I've got one right here on my floor. It's called The Cancel Wars by Sigal Ben Porat. How universities can foster free speech, promote inclusion, and renew democracy. Adrienne Marie Brown's book has been probably the one that I quote the most, and it's called We Will Not Cancel Us. If there's one book I would say, start with this, that would be it.
Is there a limit to calling in for a colleague or individual in your life to which it may be time for calling out?
I don't know, because I don't take any pleasure in calling out. So if I feel moved to the point of calling out somebody, I'm probably going to choose avoiding them before I call them out. Because calling out has become something I feel bad about now. Because there's no way when you call somebody out that you haven't invited them to a fight. Because you shamed them, you publicly humiliated them. The only thing that can happen after that is a fight. And so before I move to that step, I'd rather just put them on block or ignore or whatever. Because I don't want to make myself feel worse trying to make somebody who's incapable of doing better do better. I should confess, I have a rather linear thinking pattern because I majored in chemistry and physics. So I kind of say, I go to the solution. If that's not going to work for me, I ain't going to offer it up to somebody else. So sometimes people act on their worst behavior because they enjoy getting into fights with people. I have no obligation to make them happy that way. Who said it? Why fight with the pig? Because, you'll just both roll in the mud and only the pig will enjoy it. But that question is also deeply dependent on whether a strategy of avoidance is available to you. In my classes, I had one participant put on her feedback evaluation form that for the first time in 15 years, she had a productive conversation with her mother-in-law because she has spent 15 years going back and forth in conversational fights with her own mother-in-law, who obviously she couldn't avoid. And finally she said, at one point, I just stopped and asked my mother-in-law to tell me more about why she had an opinion that she did that I violently disagreed with because she was a Trump supporter. And once I asked her about her values and her opinions, it changed the whole tenor of the relationship. Not that I ever agreed with her, but at least we could talk. So calling outs produce fights. So unless you plan on fighting, you may want to choose another strategy. This slide has been up long enough for you to have read it, so I'm going to tell you a story. As you can tell, I do most of my teaching through stories. Let's say that you're in a staff meeting, and small staff meeting, about 6 or 7 people in it, and Joe, who is white, casually remarks, when I used to live in the suburbs, before I moved back into the city, I didn't hear all these gunshots and ambulances that I hear nowadays. And Joe's casually drinking his coffee. In this meeting is Naomi. Now, Naomi lives in the inner city neighborhood that Joe just moved to, and she's watched it get gentrified. Not only has she lost most of the neighbors and friends her multi-generational family has grown up with, but she's on the edge of getting outpriced out of her own apartment right now. So Naomi heard Joe's comment about guns and ambulances and said, what do you mean, you colonizer? Ain't nobody invited you to come to our neighborhood. And if you don't like the noise of our neighborhood, move back to the suburbs. I think what you said was racist. Okay. Now we have a situation that's blowing up the staff meeting. Joe kind of sputters, I didn't say anything racist. I didn't say anything racist. Naomi saying, yes, you did. Yes, you did. The minute that accusation is made, there's a presumption of guilt, not a presumption of innocence that you would have in a courtroom, but a presumption of guilt. And that presumption of guilt is so powerful that it makes most people who aren't in it, like Joe and Naomi, go silent because they don't want to speak up and possibly get in the crossfire. And Naomi's declaration of racism or sexism or toxic behavior or gaslighting, I mean, you can do your own substitution of the word. Naomi's declaration gets so quickly abstracted that it transitions in a nanosecond from Joe said something racist to Joe is a racist. Now it's attached to his moral character. It's a condemnation of who Joe is, not what Joe said. And the person making this type of accusation usually does it from a moral high horse. I know what racism is. I know what sexism is. I know what toxic masculinity looks like. That's the pseudo-moralism, pseudo-intellectual step. And that whole worldview is based on a dualistic system of false binaries. I'm good, you're bad, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm straight, you're gay, whatever false binaries are absolutes one is trained in. And by the way, we're all trained in these cultural absolutes, often by the religious traditions that we were raised in. And then poor Joe is caught up in a cult of unforgivability and unforgettability. Because if Joe, first of all, if he says, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say something racist, blah, 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 blah. He tries to make an apology, tries to account for the harm that he's accused of doing. Then he's going to be read as gaming the system and not being sincere. But then if he says, wait a moment, I didn't say anything wrong. All I talked about was gunshots and ambulances in my neighborhood. That is an objective fact. I didn't interpret the fact, I just talked about it. Well, then he's going to be read as trying to avoid accountability. So he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. And then there's an unforgettability about it because wherever Joe's name is mentioned in gossip, it's going to be, Joe was accused of being racist at the meeting. So then the shunning effect happens. He has the political cooties now, and no one wants to be contaminated by Joe. So other people, the other 5 people in the room, they don't want to speak up and say, whoa, let's slow down. Why did this all happen? When did this conversation go awry? Because then they're going to be read as in defense of Joe's conduct, or they're capable of infecting others. Those types of call-outs happen so frequently with such rapidity that Joe's coffee has not gotten cold yet. And all of that has already happened. This analysis was provided by Natalie Wynn, a trans YouTuber who has a wonderful thing called ContraPoint. So if you want to do some homework, you can watch her video. I should warn you, it's 2 hours. But what I'm saying is we have to learn to be able to provide this analysis to people so that they can stop getting blindsided by these blowups that nobody can figure out, well, what just happened here? We were going along on the agenda and all of a sudden the meeting blew up and everybody's mad. Now everybody's walking around afraid to say the next thing and blah, blah, blah. And we have to stop and recognize that we're dealing with a situation of dual pain, dual harm, because Naomi is in pain, obviously, because of what's happening in her community and no one seeming to want to address or can stop the gentrification that pushed all her family and now her out of a neighborhood that they've known for decades. Joe is in pain. He wasn't in pain when he first made his comment, but he's in pain now for being accused of conduct that he may or may not be guilty of and offered no chance to defend or explain himself. So if you're an HR director in this kind of situation, you've got to build a container for holding both of those sets of pain, and yet figure out strategies for them not to continue to wound each other, while not ignoring the fact that the external cause for all of this is runaway gentrification that's neither Joe's nor Naomi's fault. And so it's complicated, but we can analyze it and come up with solutions together for addressing it. Part of the thing that drives the call out culture is that we have such broad, unverifiable definitions of harm. And so it's very useful, particularly for young people, to spell out what harm actually is, physical, emotional, or psychological injury that you experience or you cause to somebody else, or when you see power being misused, or sometimes it's caused by misunderstandings or mistakes. But what harm is not is when people disagree with each other over political issues, going back to that classroom situation, or when someone makes us uncomfortable when they want us to become accountable, nor should your stance or claim for being harmed or a victim be used as a bargaining chip to excuse any harm that you do to somebody else. I mean, you don't get licensed to impose pain on others just because you're hurting. Quite often, and you can tell it's an adventure to be in my class, I tell people, instead of getting a keyboard, why don't you get a therapist? Because it is beyond the capacity of this class or my obligation as your professor to fix what I see is wrong.
What are your thoughts about using the word racist as an adjective and avoiding using it as a noun? For example, someone used a racist stereotype versus someone is a racist.
Well, I've encountered both. So I try to be accurate. I mean, since I've dealt with most specifically the white supremacist movement, they wear racist as a badge of honor. So they're very intentional about their racism, even as they say, I'm not a racist, but still, we know you're in a Klan robe. Give me a break. But then there's a lot of racial illiteracy out here where we're all raised in a very racist culture. And so we're actually raised in a toxic culture. So we can be racist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist. We can be all of those things and not intend to do harm. And so that's when I really want to probably pivot and talk about the difference between intent and deliberateness. Because if you step on my foot accidentally, that requires a different reaction than when you did it on purpose. So I don't know if I would get into that behavior was racist versus you are a racist. I tend to try not to attach to people's moral character their behaviors, because that really doesn't work anyway. And nobody likes being called names anyway. Even if they are racist, calling them one doesn't work. So that's in the for what it's worth department. In the calling in culture that I'm trying to create, I prefer, instead of attacking someone for using the N word, I want to ask them, why would you want to? How does that really work for you? Yeah. If you know that something you are doing has the potential to cause somebody else harm, the central question is, why would you want to do that? The young people have a wonderful, pithy way of saying it. When they look at somebody they think is just doing something wrong, they just look them dead in the eye and say, are you okay? In other words, what you said was not right. What you did was not right. But instead of focusing on what they did, they turn the attention to the person. And even if it's faux concern, it still redirects the conversation to, are you okay? So I think it's much better if I experience racism to turn the attention to the person and ask them, why would you choose to say something that has the potential to hurt another person? Is that who you actually are? Again, what we want is for people to become more self-aware and address the cognitive dissonance between their inner good opinion of themselves and their outer behaviors. So calling in helps them do that without calling them names. This is that paradigm shift, because we're used to nomenclature. We always want to name this, name it, name it, name it. And we're convinced that just by naming it, we can transform the world. Well, that worked when Newton named gravity. For most other stuff, we have to keep in fact that even if we use the same word as human beings, we're going to pack different meanings into that same word. Because that's how human beings are. Strangely enough, the range of human emotions is fairly limited. And so if we fall back on conveying respect, honest inquiry, grace, forgiveness, like I said, we can talk about anything using any words we want, just about. Because it's not about policing the word, it's about inquiring about why somebody would want to even say that. I think that a lot of the call out culture is driven because we don't have positive ways to deal with conflict in our society. We get the false impression that we're supposed to go through life without anybody ever hurting us, without us ever hurting anybody else. And what happens, particularly in this age of social media, there's a lot of overstatement of harm. So when somebody gets misgendered or somebody doesn't use the latest word for the heteropatriarchy, I think there's a tendency for people to look for a reason to be offended because that's their way of conveying that they're in pain. And so we need to really look at this more analytically, more scientifically, and stop addressing the symptoms and go to the root cause and help people understand that their feelings are real, but they're not necessarily factual because we all want to be validated completely, but seek the validation in another way than going around causing harm to others. You can tell I'm really excited about the possibilities of this paradigm shift, of this really rethinking all of our relationships, professional, family, academic. It has a lot of possibilities.
How does one speak so as not to offend others when everything offends someone? Can you further address the phenomena of the growing list of words that are offensive? We know it's there. What comes after that knowledge?
Well, first of all, you can never keep up. So let go of that expectation. I mean, Lily Tomlin once famously said, no matter how cynical I become, I can't keep up. I think that's what I would repeat it. I'm really trying to keep up. I'm sorry I used the word that offended you, but that's the word that I use. Why don't you help me learn better words? So you don't have to react with anger. This is them projecting on you, not you projecting on them. So you don't have to own it. In that way, that's their stuff. Because there's so many people walking around looking for opportunities to be offended and not really accepting the fact that we're all in different places. Katha Pollitt wrote a wonderful line the other day that I'm going to repeat here. She said, the right wing is making a war on women and the left wing is making a war on the word woman. And you can't win. So here I am, one of the creators of the term reproductive justice for women, and I get called out all the time because everybody doesn't have a womb. Well, everybody doesn't have a penis either, but I don't hear you fussing about that. People project their pain onto you. It is your choice whether to deal with it or not. That protects your integrity.
I'm taken by just the enormity of the work and the courage of all people's. How do you keep yourself positive? What is your North Star to keep on keeping on with this important, right at this time?
Well, next month I turn 70, so I've had a lot of time. And I've made big mistakes that ended up in national newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times and stuff. So, and at each time, I didn't think I could ever lift my head again because my mistakes were not private, but they became subject of public discourse. And then I found, I can handle this. And so that made me even braver in sharing my mistakes. And read my book, you're going to hear all that you didn't want to know about Loretta Ross, because I use my mistakes as teachable moments for myself and others. And so I don't carry the burden of hidden secrets anymore. So that helps lighten the load a hell of a lot. Way. I'm shameless that way. But I also benefited from having great mentors when I was a mouthy 16-year-old thinking I knew everything and doing political work at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And those older Black women did not give up on insufferable Loretta when they could have, because I was calling them every name but a child of God, and they still didn't give up on me. And so I've committed to offer that gift back, to not give up on people. But I really do believe in the toggle switch, which is why I can spend all day Friday and Saturday playing pinochle with no guilt, because I know I'm going to work hard for the next 21 days or stuff. And I keep around me a circle of friends who are as far away from politics as possible. I call it my geriatric pinochle crowd. While I'm protesting the Iraq war, they're doing yellow ribbon parties for the soldiers. And I know every one of them will be at my funeral because we don't let politics separate us. Now, in a practical way, let me finish with this. Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, the group I co-founded, was founded by both people who were pro-life and pro-choice. So we have practical experience bringing people together around what unites us versus what divides us. So that's what it looks like putting it in practice. Because no other successful coalition can say we're getting to our 30th anniversary in 2027, and yet we still got pro-life and pro-choice women in the same organization, and we're proud of it.
We've had so many words of gratitude for your time, Loretta, and your words of wisdom. Carol had written, "Thanks so much for your compassionate and practical advice. This will stay with me for a long time." And I think I can echo that. We are so grateful for you and for everybody who joined us today.
Can I ask one other favor? We've got an incoming president who I've yet to meet, and I'm looking forward to that. But I've been part of a multi-year team trying to get a racial justice class as a graduation requirement at Smith. As alums, please help us do that, because Smith chose to hire me, and I'm choosing to make my legacy at Smith that every person who graduates from Smith should know what I know. We need Smith graduates to be ready for the 21st century, not stuck in the 19th. Thank y'all.
As Loretta asked, as alums, you know how to use your voice. We want to use it in a compassionate and loving way. We don't need to have a petition. We just need to articulate if we stand with the request that she's made and the legacy that she wants to leave. It's an important topic. And so with our new leader, I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunities for us to discuss it. So thanks everyone for today. Thank you, Loretta.
Bye-bye.